Good afternoon or good morning from wherever you're coming from. Welcome everyone to Conversations That Matter. This is a webinar series sponsored by the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. And it focuses on the topic of human dignity and offers some pastoral strategies for addressing some of the pressing human dignity issues in the church today. So the next two conversations deal with the rise of the machines, how the internet, social media, and artificial intelligence are raising questions about what it means to be human in an increasingly digital world. So we're calling this two-episode mini-series The Virtual Apocalypse, Renewing Christian Culture in a Digital World. And this is episode 1, called The Art of Virtue. My name is Brett Robinson. I'm an associate professor of Catholic Media Studies in the McGrath Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame. The McGrath Institute for Church Life is an outreach unit at Notre Dame that connects the intellectual life of the university to the life of the church through teaching, research, and programming. So let's jump right in. If we're living in the information age, then we are all in formation. That is, we are rendered as digital information on screens and databases, and we're also being formed in a particular way by these new tools and systems and habits and behaviors. We are, in fact, in formation. But form for what? And form by what is the big question that inspired this series. So we're calling it Virtual Apocalypse, not because we are supremely pessimistic. First of all, it's a virtual apocalypse and not the real apocalypse. So no need to drop everything and get right with God, although that's never a bad idea. Instead, we are using it in the Greek sense of the term to uncover or reveal. And in Middle English, in fact, apocalypse meant vision or insight. And so we're interested in how we can gain deeper insight by seeing what's being revealed by these dramatic changes to the culture and ourselves by way of technology. And we have 3 expert guides to help us do that today. They come from both ends of the country. Michael Sacasas is in Florida at the Christian Study Center of Gainesville, but is perhaps best known for his insightful Substack and newsletter, The Convivial Society, as well as his writing in the New York Times and The Atlantic. Father Paul Soukup is coming to us from Santa Clara University in California, where he is professor in the College of Arts and Sciences, teaching courses in communications, technology, and theology. He also consults with the USCCB and has written a number of books and articles on communications, technology, and theology. And finally, Felicia Wu Song is a cultural sociologist teaching at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. Her book, Restless Devices, is a must-have for church leaders who are trying to navigate this digital world in a way that's consistent with a Christian understanding of the human person. So, before we jump in, a few things to note. If you're having any technical difficulties with sound or video or participating in the Q&A, please drop those in the chat. We want to hear your questions and comments, so please use the Q&A function throughout the episode and submit those, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible by the end of the hour. Our format today will be a roundtable discussion among our 3 panelists. And we'll begin with Dr. Song. So to set the stage, I want to pitch this question to you, Felicia. You've been studying this topic for a while. You recently spent time in Rome addressing the Vatican's dicastery for communication about this. So when we say digital technology, we're of course referring to the internet and smartphones and social media, artificial intelligence, all these tools and systems that are reshaping how we relate to one another and to reality. So if technology is reshaping, reforming our relationship to others, to time and space, to God, then maybe it's not surprising that things feel a little off kilter. You call it in your book a moment of digital discontent. Could you tell us kind of what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. When I say we're in a time of digital discontent, I'm referring to this uncomfortable sense that we have that something isn't quite right with the ways that our lives are carrying out. I think it's interesting to kind of see the arc of our digital adoption, at least in American society, that in the beginning there was a fair bit of enthusiasm, and we've adopted technologies into all aspects of our professional and personal lives. And there's a lot of pleasure and efficiency and convenience that comes out of that. But I think in the last, 5 to 7 years, people have started talking to each other, right, about actually feeling a bit overwhelmed by that inbox that never, stops filling up, and the constancy of the social media feed or instant or messaging, right, that one has to respond to, and so there's this feeling of feeling stuck, right, feeling like there's a lot of great stuff that comes out of our digital conveniences, but we also feel like we can't stop. And so even when we try to take a Sabbath or go on vacation or try to rest even in the evenings, right, we feel kind of restless, actually, right? We kind of
like
can't come down.
Is part of it there is this sort of classic kind of technology arc of optimism and utopianism, and then some of the problems surface and we get these darker visions of what might be happening. Is something weird going on with digital in the sense that it's not necessarily a straight line, because we have sort of internet, but then we have social media, and now we have artificial intelligence. Are we going through that cycle maybe even quicker, and maybe that's adding? Do you think that's adding to maybe the discontent or discomfort?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we talk about the digital landscape, you're right. Like it's not like a constant, right? It keeps on shifting with each new device. And so I think there is, however, an increasing sense of ubiquity, right? Like there's nowhere you can turn, right? In your work, in your friendships, in your church life, where you're not having to navigate how one deals with the digital. And certainly the pandemic in recent years hasn't helped, right? That kind of amplified all of our reliance on tech. But I think what's interesting to me is the way in which it's our relationships with our digital devices isn't just about the actual behaviors of being on our screens or feeling compelled to be on our screens. It's actually become a kind of state of consciousness, right? It like lives with us, this sense of, oh, there's emails to check, or there's messages I need to respond to, or there's posts, right, that I just posted and I'm interested in if anyone acknowledged that I exist, right? All those kinds of things are constant in our minds, even when we are not necessarily on our devices. And I think we have this intuitive sense, right, that not only something not quite right, but as you mentioned before, with all the kind of added layers of new technologies, this isn't going to stop, right? There's kind of this sense of like, it's just going to get worse. Meta, right? Virtual reality, all this stuff. It's just like more and more and more, and kind of a wondering of like, how am I going to not just keep up, but just manage, right? All these different aspects.
In a Christian context, then it seems like there's this kind of intractable problem of, we want to promote the gospel, we want to share these messages, we have all these new means to do that. We've always done that through history, through different means of communication, new means, and yet there's this unease or dis-ease among those who use these frequently, and so we reach kind of a little bit of a cognitive or spiritual impasse where the effects of the device perhaps are diffusing or undermining the Christian message perhaps that we're trying to convey through it. How do you kind of reconcile that in what you've been studying? I know you do a lot of interviews as sociologists. Like, what are you hearing kind of on the ground among Christians who are navigating kind of these two poles of digital experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for people of faith, it is the challenge is trying to have a well-ordered life, right? I mean, in the end of the day, I think that is the best framework for thinking about technologies in the context that we live in. Because on the one hand, the temptation is just to say, well, there's too many negative forces being formed negatively by these digital practices and devices, so much so that I just need to get rid of them, right? So one way is to just, okay, I'm just going to pitch it all, right? The other way is you could take the path of, well, my work requires this, my personal relationships require, my family is spread out all parts of the world, right? So this is inevitable, a kind of technological inevitability. We just have to put up with it and live our kind of pious lives over here. But the technology is, the rest of it. But I think there's something, the complicated space, in some ways, those are the easy poles. The more challenging space is trying to figure out, how do I faithfully live into not only the missional call of what it means to follow Christ, but also I think the language is the anthropology, the theological anthropology of who God has created us to be as human beings. How do I live into all of that, embodied, relational, right? Capable of being present to God, others, myself.
You mentioned practices. I want to follow that line a little bit, because I feel like a lot of times the attention is focused on kind of content. So, if we clean up this content, or we censor this content and not that content, that will somehow, heal the culture or create a more civil space for us to do this as human beings. So when you hear about the problems like pornography or political polarization or distraction, it seems like a lot of those are maybe distractions from a deeper issue, which is how these forms and practices, habits, rituals, I think you even call them kind of like counterfeit liturgies, they're shaping culture in a sense more than the content they carry. So this is the old McLuhan idea, right? That in the industrial age, didn't matter if the train was carrying coal or cornflakes. The fact that we had trains just remapped everything. And I think the same can be said today with digital. It doesn't matter whether it's, whatever, Mr. Beast videos on YouTube or ChatGPT writing screenplays. It's reshaped everything: social life, economics, entertainment, research, habits, practices, behavior. So are there some maybe formal characteristics to help us see those kind of larger contours around how the form itself is shaping? And I assume there's some holdovers here from that industrial age too, but there's some of these I think you identify in your book that I think might be helpful for folks to hear about.
Yeah, for sure. I think, certainly one of the holdovers from the larger thrust of industrialization is the drive to quantify, right? Anyone who's on social media knows that if you're on that platform, right, it's built to numerically quantify how many people are following you, how much of affirmation or lack thereof you get for any utterance you make into the universe. And so I think when we step back and actually think about it, it's actually a really strange thing to quantify one's significance or the worth of one's words, right? But I think when one is in that space in a habitual way, right, one gets used to, right, and the quantification becomes normalized in how we evaluate each other, how we evaluate ourselves. I think a lot of young people know that the form of social media also drives us to perform, right? There's a lot of conversation about a lack of authenticity, the ways in which we create these perfect images of ourselves. And so all the communication that these communication technologies are supposed to be enhancing actually don't result in actual communication. We are merely broadcasting or performing for each other what we think others will affirm, right? And again, these aren't intentional, right? It's just the way the system is actually built to constantly reward these kinds of performances. And so that it's a subtle formation, right? And no one's actually going in thinking, oh, this is what I want to do. But it is the normalized habitual practice, right, of being in social media where it's you couldn't do otherwise, right? Or if you tried, you would be penalized.
Right. And that's such a good connection, because I think prior to the internet, we were habituated by television. So the performance impulse was already there. And then we got a stage to do it on. So, these metaphors and these holdovers from the industrial age matter today. And I think you point them out so so well and so clearly. It seems like there's also kind of in terms of quantification, if you look at ChatGPT, what it has done is kind of mathematized language, right? Like it's come up with these predictive algorithms to figure out which word comes next. And so now even language, which was, not part of mathematics, it was part of the trivium and so on. Now it's part of this sort of mathematical calculation, which takes it to a whole nother level. And I want to maybe follow a little bit along some things you were hinting at in terms of form and structure, that, and in a sense, like this is an environment that we've created, right? It's not, let me toss the device out and now I'm free. It's actually that I inhabit an environment that is very much structured by both these kind of industrial norms and kind of the bureaucratic apparatus and state that grew out of that. And now what has been called the technocratic paradigm, right? So Pope Francis talks about this in Laudato Si, how in fact, these tools aren't neutral because they're often controlled by certain powerful groups, economic, political groups. That encyclical, which I commend everyone to read if you haven't, is ostensibly about the environment, but it's also about these media environments. And he does kind of gesture in that direction throughout the encyclical. I'm wondering, Father Paul, if you could help us maybe unpack that a little bit, because you do this work in media ecology, which kind of brings together these two concepts. Help us make sense of this kind of environmental metaphor in a theological sense. What is media ecology, and how can it help us understand what the Pope is up to in Laudato Si?
I think we can do this by taking a step back in different ways, a step back in time and a step back in distance. You've hinted at some of this already, that if we're too close to something, we tend not to see it. When we get a little more perspective, as you mentioned about the train, it could be carrying cornflakes or it could be carrying coal. But we don't know that until we step back far enough to see what's in the train. Media ecology urges us to make that step back, to recognize that we live in a communication environment. And like any communication or any environment or ecosystem, we hit moments where things are more or less balanced out. Let me use the analogy, of a pond and the forest. And you get the frogs in the pond and the fish in the pond and the plants growing there and the bugs and the birds, and everything is balanced out. You put an invasive species in and it disrupts everything. And we're not quite sure what to do anymore. Well, that, in a sense, is what we've been doing with our communication over the last 100 years in a kind of rapid sort of way. We keep adding new invasive species. The most recent, just 15 years ago, is this. We all get our smartphones, and it changes everything. People don't speak on the phone anymore; they text. People don't read a newspaper; you have a news feed. People don't watch television. You get short videos. You can think of all of the different ways that our entire communication practice changes just when we introduce something new. And what that should do is help us focus a little bit on the larger environment. What was going on before we put this invasive species in? I mean, anytime we introduce something like that, we've got a moment of saying, all right, we've understood ourselves a little bit more.
When you say, sorry to interrupt, but when you say invasive, that sounds kind of like a negative, but in a sense, what you're saying is, like any ecosystem, the goal is to sort of reestablish an equilibrium. So if something new comes in, good or bad, the system itself needs to sort of recalibrate.
Exactly. Thank you for that correction, because invasive, I was using it in a neutral way, but you're right, it carries a negative connotation. Maybe that's part of our own default setting. We look at something new and we think, oh my goodness, what's this doing to us? Rather than what opportunities does it present to us? Because media ecology will tell us we need to think about technologies as having affordances. They allow us to do things, and we make choices about what we do. If we step back in that historical way, we can see it a little bit more clearly. So let's think of, sometimes people don't even realize it's technology, writing. Or if you want the technological side of it, you could think about printing. And we gradually take in this particular technological way of exchanging information, storing information, writing things which could be sent across distances. So I don't need to be in one place, but my thought can show up somewhere at great distances. We travel through time with writing. We look at materials that have come to us from thousands of years ago. And yet we also realize that that is not just a small kind of thing. There have been studies that can track how learning to write rewires the human brain. Human beings adapt to the use of that technology, and we begin thinking, literally thinking differently because we have a given technology. But that's not only at a personal level, it happens on a societal level too, because you think of all of the supporting things that make up an environment that's based on writing as an information process. And so you have everything from booksellers, you have people creating paper, we transform our entire way of living, and the environment adjusts to it. So it seems absolutely normal.
And when we move from one to another, say writing to print to electric to digital and so on, we don't lose the previous. No. So we have this accretion of modes. A friend of mine calls it nested epistemology. So, as little babies, we come to know the world through speech and orality and sound, and then we learn to read. And we build on each one. Do you feel like maybe, Felicia was talking about a little bit of this discontent and confusion around new tools. Have we reached a point where, a young child who's 2 or 3 is on an iPad has lost that kind of nested epistemology in the sense of, first learning the art of speech, then the art of writing, then you know what I mean? So it's sped up so much that we skip ahead and we lose the connection to those modes. And I think what media ecology says, and maybe you can help me here and correct it, is that there are different occasions for these sort of different affordances, that we don't get rid of the old ones. There's times where a handwritten letter would be nice. Like I'm raising teenagers and they think they can do everything through text. I can ask a girl out. I can also break up with a girl, all of this via this very impersonal medium.
But you should write your grandmother a handwritten note to say thank you.
Right. So that ecological awareness, how do you cultivate that? I think this is a really important question for the church, because there is this kind of progress impulse that, hey, there's a new tool, let's use it to its fullest. It's an opportunity, it's an affordance. And then we forget about some of these other modes of relationship that are actually, in some ways, a little more human. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say that you're right and you're wrong. And so, yes, we carry all of these things with us. It doesn't disappear. I mean, the fact that I can have a smartphone that does all these things doesn't make me forget how to write or to read. And the technologies, as your friend said, can be nested, but we evolve along with those technologies. Just as the brain shifts to be able to handle writing, we also as a species begin to bring new things. The child who grows up with the technology doesn't even see it as a technology. It's just simply the way the world is. In a sense, you sound a little bit like Plato, those millennia ago, worrying about writing. What's writing doing to us? Because Plato comes from an oral world and sees the threat of this technology. You jump forward 400 or 500 years and people see writing as absolutely normal. But then they worry about, adding something else. So I guess it's part of the innate conservatism of being human. We don't want to see something that we like go away. And we forget that we are evolving along with it. It's a way of being human that we adjust to these things. We create these environments. And then, in effect, the environments create us.
Let me muddy the waters a little bit more, Father. If we talk about the industrial and the digital, right? There's sort of two paradigms, but they're interwoven now. In the industrial age with factories and machines, we were extending our physical powers, right? Like McLuhan says that all technologies are an extension of the self or the human person. So the hammer extends the fist and so on. These machines make us more physically powerful to manipulate nature. It seems there's something fundamentally different about these media technologies and digital in particular, because the nature that it's manipulating is not physical nature, but psychological. So as Christians, we think of psyche or psychology as not just the mind, but the soul. So when these technologies start to infiltrate or reshape or reform the soul and shape them, if we're not conscious of that extension and that relationship, what do we need to watch out for? What are, again, going back to practices, like what does a Christian do to, again, what we do is we pursue God, and we pursue the life of the soul, the interior life. And it seems like that's where we are now with a lot of these tools. We're tinkering with the interior life, how we think and how we communicate. And the machines are starting to learn that too. What does Christian practice and tradition and teaching bring to that to help us navigate?
I think it brings a hope. I mean, if we look at Christianity, which is, in my mind, a religion of communication, it is the word that is made flesh, and it is the word that sustains us. And Christianity has never feared communication technology, and it is taken each one of those. I mean, if we take Anselm's kind of definition of theology as faith seeking understanding, that's something everyone does. And people have done this in every medium. When writing became, part of the Christian tradition, not just the oral gospels, but to write the gospels down, Christianity created a form, for passing that along, and eventually chooses the codex as a way that is more efficient than the scroll. The same thing when people reached out, those who were skilled in art began reflecting on their belief in artistic forms. And we can look at the ways the different artistic tools were used. Christianity did the same with music. It embraced not only musical tradition, but continues to develop it and invent new tools. And you look through at least Western Christianity, the use of musical instruments as ways of reflecting on belief. We get the same thing after the printing press. The key thing is the essay. It's not something that comes with a handwritten manuscript, but it's something that comes in a printed form, and we literally embrace this new technology to reflect on our faith. So we're constantly reflecting on our faith, and different generations will do it as people know those tools. I don't think we can just start from a priori and say, get rid of a given tool. No, let's let our Christian faith reflect on itself using the tools in the environments in which it is. I think the worst thing that we can do is worry. The best thing we can do is have hope and say, let's continue to work in this environment. Some things will flourish, some things will pass away, just as that metaphor of the pond and the forest. It reaches a new balance. But Christianity and faith doesn't go away. God is greater, as John writes in the first letter, than our consciences. God is greater than our imaginations.
So I want to bring, thank you, Father. I want to bring Michael into the conversation and maybe pursue this idea about, again, these Christian practices or virtues or habits that help us navigate each new iteration. I think we've established that we're in a confusing time, not necessarily because it's bad, but because we're learning something new, a new extension of the self. And as Father said, it actually affords us some great ways to reflect on our own beliefs and faith and tradition. And the internet happens to be a really, really, really powerful memory tool. And so you're seeing, I think, a lot of movements within the church and within Christianity of recovering older practices and learning all sorts of things about the faith and tradition and history of the church that weren't really accessible before. So I think that's another on the plus side of the ecology equation. But Michael, you've talked about this in connection with virtue formation, and in a recent article, you actually referred to certain media technologies as, quote, carefully calibrated engines of sloth, greed, envy, despair, and self-loathing. But you've also talked about the positives, but you've written extensively about this connection between our technological environment and virtue formation. So could you help us maybe understand that connection a little bit more? How are those two kind of worlds or practices connected?
Yeah, I will at least try. So my own interest in technology, I think, began taking shape around this particular question, in fact. So the the question took the form of something like this. I may have this set of expressed beliefs or these aspirations with regards to the sort of person that I want to be, the kind of family I want to raise, the kind of community I want to live in, et cetera. And we may hold these beliefs and aspirations very passionately and devoutly, and yet they don't tend to materialize for any number of reasons, of course. But one of the reasons why they may not materialize seem to have something to do with the shape and the contours of the technological environment in which I resided, which was the water I swam in. And understanding this, I think, became important to me because it was a matter of seeing that the technology around me was not neutral with regards to whatever my moral aspirations or my desires for the kind of society I wanted to inhabit might be. The technology wasn't simply a neutral tool, but was in fact interacting in a way where it might inhibit, it might support and sustain some of those aspirations, but it might also inhibit and preclude the possibility of fulfilling those aspirations. And so it seemed to me at the time, this was maybe 20 years ago, that not that many people were paying attention to that way in which technology was formative and not merely instrumental. So I thought about the way we are formed as human beings with regards to our character. And I sort of think in terms of the virtue ethic tradition with regards to the way that habits become ingrained in us and give us dispositions, and these become inclinations and then generate either virtues or vices, right? And this agglomeration of virtues and vices is our character. And then it was interesting to me to then think about if we think of habits, they can be intellectual habits, but they often are embodied habits. And we take up our tools through our body, right? So there's this interface, if you like, of the world, the tool, and the self through the body. And so the tools sort of enter into those cycles of moral formation, to those patterns of moral formation. In other words, we form habits through our tool use, not independently of them. The tools, they induce certain habits in us. They cultivate certain practices. They eliminate other practices.
So it's easy, seems to me it's easy to see the vices that might, and we've mentioned some already, whether it's pornography or gambling or political rancor. They're easier to see oftentimes as human beings. We tend to devolve to the lowest common denominator when it comes to these things. Help us, and this is for everyone really, I mean, what are the virtues, do you think, that are being cultivated in the new environment? And if that's too hard of a question, could you point to a previous environment and point to some virtues that grew out of that perhaps were strengthened in some way or enhanced by this? I love the relationship you set up there between tool and world itself. So would love to hear just some examples of virtue.
Yeah, I'll answer it a little sideways. So I think we are in a situation where we carry over this impulse, as T.S. Eliot put it, to devise systems so perfect that nobody will have to be good anymore, right? So this idea that we're going to outsource virtue to a code or a set of rules, and then simultaneously, I think much of what we've been discussing today seems to revolve around systems that are so imperfect that they require an immense amount of virtue, maybe more virtue than we're able to give, right? I'm thwarted in that line you cited, right? There's so many temptations that may present themselves. I think we can formulate them as temptations.
Say more about that, because in the article you talk about digital literacy as being a supposed kind of virtue or way that to be good in this environment, and yet it poses problems. Can you say more about that?
I think what I had in mind there is that we sort of inhabit this environment of information superabundance online, right? So we have this overwhelming feed of information that comes at us in countless different forms. And oftentimes that is just sort of passive entertainment or whatever. Other times it's information that seems kind of vital, maybe, right? About political culture, about how to navigate a pandemic in recent years. And we have this multiplicity of sources that feed into our awareness of what is happening. But often these involve what is sometimes called misinformation or factual error, or things are misleading, or surmises that are not built on good premises. And we're expected to, at some level, adjudicate these. I think what the current media environment generates is a situation where we even become more aware of the fact that even reputable experts disagree about things, right? So we're thrust into this position of constantly having to adjudicate claims that are being made, outlandish claims that strike some people outlandish, that strike other people as perfectly reasonable way to connect the dots that they are perceiving. So we're asked to develop media literacy, which is fine. We have these practices that are commended to us about fact checking, all that. My point in the article is simply that it's virtually impossible for people to consistently carry that through, given the scale of information we often receive. So in this way, I say, this system is so imperfect in the sense that it requires more virtue than we probably have, right? We have to remain humble, have the courage to believe we're wrong. All these things are kind of required, but we have to display that moment by moment when we're online if we're interested in arriving at the truth of this or that claim. Or else we just devolve into our camps where we just take for granted what the people on our side of whatever divide you might imagine, religious, political.
Yeah, I think you're raising important tension here, and one that maybe we can pursue as a group, and then get into some questions. But it seems like in this example of media literacy that it requires time, patience, some kind of persistence around, like you said, fact checking something, looking something up in reputable sources that may not even be online. We may have to go find a book somewhere that has the actual information in it. God forbid. But it seems like that virtue, let's call it a virtue for the sake of the argument, of efficiency or speed, right, is in some ways the governing virtue. And this goes back to the sort of industrial mode of, if we can make it faster and make more of it, then it's good. And that kind of industrial bureaucratic mode bleeding into the new digital information mode, which is we can process information very quickly and we can send it out very quickly and we can create lots of it. And it reminds me of the whole sort of food crisis in the middle of the 20th century that we're all paying for now in healthcare, which is crappy packaged processed food that made us all sick. And now we've got a lot of crappy packaged processed information from all the way from bad websites to ChatGPT that just makes stuff up half the time. And we're just ingesting it at these alarming rates and creating what might be called more of a mind sickness or a soul sickness. And it seems like that governing virtue of efficiency and speed is the dictating logic by which this sort of thing happens. And so I know you've written about this. I know we've all thought about this as Christians and as believers, but how do we, what is the corrective or the antidote to that? To Father Paul's point, like we can't just check out of this environment. We're in the environment, we're immersed in it, it's the water. So in some ways we have to obey its logic and structure. But what do we do when that's the governing logic, speed and efficiency?
I think my unreflective answer is somehow slow down, right? And there's a great line from McLuhan that I love, which is that there's no inevitability as long as we're willing to contemplate what is happening. So figuring out some perspective by which we might be able to achieve a measure of understanding. Now, oftentimes this is, may seem inadequate and may, by some measures, perhaps be inadequate because it doesn't guarantee that we'll be able to act upon whatever insights or understanding that we gain. There are ways in which our agency gets distributed through these systems and is limited and constrained with regards to the ways that we might be able to navigate. I think it is right that we're more, we have the option of refusal, uncritical acceptance, or some form of navigation, as Felicia was saying earlier, and we are more likely than not trying to navigate. The question is whether the degree to which we are granted agency to even perform those acts of navigation as best as possible. So I would say, one of the things that I have, there are many ways that one could answer this, and to get back more directly to the question of what virtues we might seek for or try to cultivate. And I think I've been reflecting a fair amount on Iris Murdoch's work, and Murdoch talks a great deal about the necessity to attentively reflect on reality, right? To pay attention to reality, she says somewhere is that which is revealed to the patient eye of love, right? And I think part of our problem is driven by the speed, the scale, the pace of contemporary life. We have very little time to reflect, to perceive, to attend to things well and deliberately. And she says, attention is rewarded by a knowledge of reality. The virtue that she connects with that is humility. All right, and so she says that humility isn't a habit of self-effacement. Instead, it is a selfless respect for reality, and one of the most difficult and central of all virtues. And I've thought a lot about what it might mean to cultivate this habit, the habit of attention grounded in the virtue of humility before reality, so that we might be able to contemplate it, receive its rewards, understand it. I think from a theological perspective, to also sort of hear the voice of God speaking through natural revelation as well. So there are many rewards that are incumbent for us to receive. And I think maybe that might be a kind of grounding and anchor that we need in order to navigate, as it were, these contentious waters that we must of necessity be swimming through now or steering through.
Yeah, that's well said. I want to invite Felicia, Father Paul, in to maybe comment on some of this too.
I just to piggyback off of what Michael said, when I think about the efficiency and speed, I actually think about the ways in which what is championed in our digital ecology or landscape is actually the virtue of maximal optimization, right? Mm-hmm. That every single moment, every single fiber of my body needs to be getting information. And that is actually that mode of that orientation towards life is actually what will lead to a good, successful life, right? A life well lived. And it's that modality of maximal optimization that then shuts down the possibilities of boredom. And I think the studies on boredom are actually really interesting these days, right? About how we think of boredom as being wasteful, right? As being lazy, or, like it's just this empty time that our brains are not doing anything. But there's so much interesting research now about how our brains are actually in a different modality when we are bored, right? And it's when we are bored, not actively consuming information or being stimulated by something, right, happening, that it's the part of our brain that is engaged in self-reflection, in creating narrative in one's life events, in experiencing empathy, right? Thinking about the conversation we just had with someone who we disagreed with and thinking through, oh, well, maybe this is why they reacted this way, right? And it's only in that space, right, of doing nothing, quote unquote, right, that one can arrive at everything Michael was talking about, right, of that interior development and processing that I think our current digital life just doesn't allow or value, right? There's no value of that. And I think about young people, just, like boredom is the scariest thing, right? And that is exactly why, I ask my students all the time, when do you find yourself online? When I'm bored, right? So it's the boredom is like the scariest thing, the thing you want to run from, but that may be actually the place, right, for all the things that we're talking about.
Well, and a good practical example of this as a parent, like on the one hand, you're like, you want to encourage that. And on the other hand, you're terrified that the kid's going to be bored because then it's complaints and whining and so on. But I think there's I've had these experiences, especially with my younger children, where, we all do this with the phone. We're taking pictures constantly of the kids, and there's this sort of linear stream of photography that goes into the ether. And imagine, and we did this because we were bored once. We just went back and looked at old pictures and then told stories. And so you have this moment of memory and recollection and reflection with your children. So it's embodied. You're sitting with them. You're talking about what happened in this picture. And oftentimes they're too young to remember. And in the process, they're developing a sense of identity, a sense of history, a sense of belonging to this family. So in this sense, the digital medium becomes the means by which we exercise our memory and our reflection and our, and it's in a moment of boredom. So I think there are creative ways to marry these things. And I think, again, what we're pointing to is these sort of drives towards efficiency and these other things which tend to dominate the logic, because it's how commercial society works in terms of progress and growth. And I think there's probably counter practices that we as Christians can start to develop or encourage. I think we've developed many that sort of heal this, right? Or that push back against it in a way that doesn't involve this kind of Luddite reaction. Father Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, because in our question and answer, we have a couple of questions that address this particular thing. One is a comment about a book from Johann Hari, Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention, How to Think Deeply Again. And then Andrew writes a question about the memory and other things like that. When I read that, I couldn't help but think of something. I haven't thought this through enough, because just a couple of days ago, one of my students in a presentation pointed out the research, and I haven't even been able to track down her sources on this, that shows now, human attention span has been shortening over the time, and now our attention span is about the same as that of a goldfish, a certain number of seconds. And, we can kind of wring our hands about that, but then it got me thinking about attention span and value of it. Clearly, these are connected to print literacy. We need to focus our attention to read a text. And that means that I have to sort of block other things out to look at that, and including blocking other people out. If I'm reading attentively, I don't want to be disturbed. In fact, it's a way even now we can signal that if you're on an airplane, you don't want to talk to somebody, pull a book out, and everybody immediately knows, you're focused and they shouldn't talk to you. But that is relatively new in the scope of human history, about thousands of years. Probably, and this is my surmise with no evidence, early humanity had to have a short attention span because you wouldn't survive if you didn't. You had to constantly survey the environment. You were looking for food, or you were avoiding predators, or whatever it might be. And so you couldn't stop and think of one thing, abstract yourself, because otherwise you're likely to be eaten by the next tiger that came along. And so this notion of attention span, I think we have to recognize, is new to humanity. It's part of our training and literacy. And I have to smile at all of us looking at our kind of average age of the panel here and say, well, of course, we were all brought up to be literate, and the fact that we chose careers in academia also means that, we have this huge emphasis on literacy. Okay, not a bad thing, but there are other ways of being human. We have to be a little cautious in our hand-wringing. There is a well-documented area of communication research called the third person effect, in which we tend to think various whether media, in that case of communication, will have a greater effect on other people than on ourselves. So if this is a commercial that's out there, it's other people will be convinced to buy that product, not me. If there is a pornographic website, other people are going to be affected by that, but not me. And so there's a certain worry about others that comes through.
Do you think that's
now,
true in the context
well, I think the third person effect is correct. We always worry more about others than ourselves. Within Christianity, part of it is a religion of the book. And so it fosters deep reflection. And there are benefits to that reflection, as you have pointed out. And Felicia, I thought you put it very well in terms of the times we use that downtime. And if we can reflect, there are good things that happen with it. But we have to balance a kind of wholesale worry about shortened attention span with a look at the affordances of what a longer attention span does to us, and that it is connected to certain technologies.
Yeah, and
as I said, that's kind of unreflective. My student tossed it out. I've been thinking about it the last couple of days, so I got no evidence, and feel free just to say this guy's nuts.
No, I think you're hitting on a lot of points of truth, and I think I was curious about the third person effect, because it seems like that's referring to content. That if I watch this doesn't affect me, but if they watch it, I wonder if there's something different going on with, habits around devices. I think all of us admit, like, geez, I spend a lot of time on that. And so you're less maybe likely to condemn your neighbor because you realize you're doing it too, and you're trying to come up with ways to shorten that. But
I think that's a great point. But again, I think as Michael has done and several others, we do need to become reflective about our technologies. I just gotten a copy of a book by Robert Woods and Robert, I forgot his co-author, about digital Sabbaths. Then that's a custom that I think many people recognize, that maybe we do need to take those moments of rest and step back.
Yeah, we have a question here from Jose. You had mentioned, Father, that Christianity is a religion of communication, and the Christians shouldn't be afraid of new technologies. So when and where and why and how did we begin to fear? Is this a new thing in the digital age, or is it? I mean, you had mentioned Plato and Socrates and Phaedrus and writing, although that struck me as more of kind of a, I don't know, philosophical reflection on the difference between the two. Whereas now there's almost like a panic around things. Is that different? Has that been accelerated? And this is
I think it's accelerated in the same way that Felicia pointed out, that with so much information and we don't know how to manage it, there is a constant concern. But I think there was probably, at each stage of introducing communication things in Christianity, there were some people who questioned it. And so we had the whole debate about iconoclasm, whether artistic expression should be part of our theological, toolkit. There was worry, I think, about the output of the early printing press, whether through the Reformation and the ways of trying to manage either through the index of books or other things like this. So at each stage, if people are worried, there was stages about worry about the mass newspaper, where the church condemned this kind of information for the masses. There was worry about motion pictures.
Yeah, Neil Postman makes the point that maybe God himself was worried about these things when he made a commandment against graven images. So God has weighed in on the media ecology debate a little bit too.
God's on our side, yes.
But it points to this very kind of fundamental, essential issue around how we represent our reality, and particularly in our religion, and how that affects kind of our sensory experience, right? So we have all sorts of debates and conversations around liturgy and worship and art, as you said, and architecture. This is good architecture, that's bad architecture. Why? Well, this one's more vertical, it points me to heaven. So there's all these shaping mechanisms by which we come to get closer to God, built into the spaces that we create.
It has created our environment. One of Neil Postman's colleagues for many years, Christine Nystrom, has a wonderful short essay called "Literacy is Deviance," because, and she actually goes back to the same scriptures that Neil Postman quotes from. Literacy has pushed us in one way, but as she said, the only reason we had to invent writing was because we didn't have television. If television had been around, and it says the word became flesh and God wanted to interact with us through all of our senses, and so not just writing. So you can take it for what it's worth, but she was kind of pushing the envelope a little, and I think taking a dig at her colleague.
Well, Felicia, you've talked about this relationship between liturgy and practice and our new technological environment. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that in the context of church, it can be easy to think about liturgy as being exclusive to that which is happening on, inside the church building or on a Sunday morning. There are worship liturgies, but I've kind of been really drawn by Jamie Smith's analogies of secular liturgies being habits that we take on often in an unreflective way, that are that we're exposed to just by virtue of living in our culture and our society, and that what I do with Smith's work is I say, well, yeah, that makes sense. Our digital practices are forming us as in the same ways that our worship liturgies are forming us, right? They are directing us towards some vision of what it means to be human, of what the kingdom of God or isn't, right? Or directing us away from the kingdom of God. And so when it comes to thinking about the ways that our digital forms us, I just constantly come back to the idea that the conversation the church needs to be having is actually less about technology per se when it comes to practices, that is, and more about discipleship. That it is ultimately, that conversation within the church is ultimately about how, discipleship of like, that is a process of being formed, right? And so we just happen to be living in a time when our digital technologies are quite prominent in the ways that we are being formed. But throughout history, right, Christians have been discipled by all sorts of other things, right, besides the intentional acts of following Jesus, right? And so working through the nuts and bolts of a life of discipleship is not new, right?
Right.
What's new is just that we're dealing with a digital context that is quite pervasive. It is enmeshed in many areas of our lives, and we need to do the work of sifting through, right, to see if the digital practices are in fact helping us, as you mentioned before, right? Like, are we using the technology, right, to live the lives that God has intended us to live, or is the technology using us, right?
That's
is it
really
driving
good.
us, instead?
Yeah, that's really good. Start with discipleship and then interpret technology through that lens and not in the reverse. I'm wondering, Michael, because you've written this article on outsourcing.
I want to call just attention to one thing, because I think it fits with Felicia. Marie has a comment in the question and answer about her high school students being afraid to be alone with themselves. But I think your idea, Felicia, of discipleship is exactly how we address that. Forgive me, Michael, I didn't mean to take away Brett's question from you, but I thought Marie's comments was very good.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, and please, those watching, we have a couple more minutes. So if you do have some last second questions or comments, please send them in. I'm just wondering because I'm looking at this other question from Andrew. You had written this article on outsourcing virtue, and Andrew's talking about almost like outsourcing a lot of our other mental functions like memory and so on. We used to remember phone numbers, all these sorts of things. And I'm thinking about Felicia's comments at the beginning around this sense of discomfort or confusion, and this idea of the technology being an extension of the self. So if we've extended the mind, whether it's the memory, the imagination, to these devices, what are we losing? What are we gaining? How do we, to Father Paul's point, maybe reestablish or establish an equilibrium? Because it seems like a slippery slope.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to reinforce or reiterate Felicia's point, I think it is important to start with the good, right? What is the good that you're aiming at? You can talk about this in terms of discipleship. What kind of formation do you want to see in the person? But it can apply even more broadly. Just what is the good we're aiming at, rather than immediately trying to reactively limit technology or refuse it. But in view of that, right, so with the question of memory, yes, if you outsource your memory, right, we talk about these external minds, your notebook becomes one in extended mind theory, right? There's this famous case of Otto's notebook that kind of functions in tandem with his mind, so that some suggest that it gets incorporated into his mind, right? But once you outsource memory in this way, you tend to lose it. Precisely. Now we mistake. I think there are two things that are happening. One, we mistake access for what we call human memory, right? So that I am able to access something, or that I know where to access it, is not. It's analogous to my remembering, but it's not, exactly like that. In a distinctly Christian context, there's a very easy way to think about this, I think, right? So whatever it means for Paul to say that we ought to let the word of Christ dwell richly in us, I'm fairly certain it doesn't mean that I can readily search for it in an app, right? that in a sense, if we think about there being certain things that it is good for us to internalize, so that it is already intermingling with our thoughts in ways that we can't even quite understand, right? That it becomes part and parcel of the interpretive apparatus that we bring to our perception of reality moment by moment. That's what happens when you internalize something. Simply knowing that it's there is a little different. And so maybe one thing to outsource phone numbers, right? I can, make the case that that's certainly not problematic, morally problematic. It's another thing to then take that leap and say, well, if I outsource phone numbers, I can thereby outsource all other forms of what I might have in another age or another time memorized. And I think it's a question of what is it good for us to actually internalize? What is it illicit to, externalize?
I want to pause just a moment. Thank you for that excellent comment. We're at 1:00, so I know some people have to get off the call. Our panelists have agreed to stay for a couple extra minutes because we have a couple questions, and we'll try to get to those. Those that we don't get to, please consider registering for our next webinar in this series, episode 2, which is the virtue of art. So today was the art of virtue. We talked about the virtues. Next time we'll be talking to artists and talking about the creative and hopeful ways in which technology might provide new ways to express the faith, express ourselves in this new context. And that's going to be on Tuesday, April 11th at noon Eastern. And that registration link is in the chat and is on the same page where you registered for this one. So for those who have to depart, please consider joining us again for the second part of this series on April 11th at noon. A question from Philip, talking about the third person effect for the panel. He's reminded of Rene Girard's idea of mimetic desire and wonders if there's a link between the two. So in brief, Girard's theory is that we desire things because other people desire them. He kind of learned that and became actually Catholic convert through reading a lot of the great literature of the past, and saw this pattern in human behavior of desire based on what others desire. So maybe first to Father Paul and others, is mimetic desire in play here? And if so, how?
I will just have to admit ignorance on that. I am not sure that there's a connection. And without digging through the footnotes in Girard's work, I wouldn't want to take a stab at it.
Any Girardians who want to jump in here?
I'm not a Girardian, but it just strikes me as it is interesting the degree to which the other, whether that other is mainly sort of conceived in our mind as our idea of the other, or the other in the face-to-face interaction, how much work the other does in shaping us and giving us back to ourselves through both in ways that we might think are virtuous, and maybe also in ways that we might wish were not the case, but how much we are the emergence of the self happens in tandem with the other, whether it's with respect to how we envision the world, how the world works, or the formation of our own desires.
Well, I guess one very literal interpretation or answer to that question might be the story about Peter Thiel, who was an early investor in Facebook, given Mark Zuckerberg $500,000 when he was still in his dorm room at Harvard. Peter Thiel studied with Rene Girard at Stanford, and Thiel was fascinated by this idea of mimetic desire and what grows out of it, which is mimetic rivalry. So when you desire what the other desires, you enter into a rivalry, which then leads to violence, and then someone gets scapegoated. And so what he saw in Christianity, and the reason he converted, was that Christ was the ultimate scapegoat, because we were always looking for guilty parties to blame to absolve us of our own faults and sins. And so Christ breaks this circuit by becoming the innocent victim. And so Thiel saw something in Facebook, I think, that resembled Girard's idea of mimetic desire, that people would post and share and comment on things because other people were posting and sharing, and you get into this kind of mimetic loop. So in a sense, it's built into the logic of the digital culture. Some of the founders of it and programmers of it were very conscious indeed of this mimetic dynamic within social media in particular. So now, my question is, what happens when the ChatGPT starts imitating us and we get into a mimetic rivalry with our AI friends who are writing and seemingly creating at levels that only humans could do before? Who gets scapegoated there? So let's conclude by thanking again our excellent guides today, Michael Sacasas, Dr. Felicia Wusong, and Father Paul Soukup. So again, thank you all for joining us from the McGrath Institute for Church Life and the University of Notre Dame. On behalf of all of us, thank you, and we hope to see you for episode 2.